lost everything. I knew him for 8 years and looked up to him, until I finally discovered that there was something very wrong with him. This isn't scary per se, but it's always creepy when someone you've known forever and thought of like a mentor is revealed to be something much, much different. So, I had this boss who I'll call Mike, and he had come to fill in for a few months while my regular boss was on maternity leave. It was pretty amazing. He inspired me to work harder and even ended up promoting me. The two of us and a third employee that I'll call James were always working shifts together. It was fun, just laughing and kicking ass because we all had a similar sense of humor, and James and I were definitely the best employees there. After Mike's time to fill in was over, James and I were super bummed because he was seriously the best manager. He was fair and rewarded hard work and truly cared about employee satisfaction. Plus, he just made everything fun, even though we were working harder. We both looked up to Mike as a manager and as a human being. We had the utmost respect for him, and we vowed to keep in touch when we parted ways. Well, fast forward a year or so, James and I ended up dating. We kept in touch with Mike, and he was so happy we ended up together because he had thought we were great people who deserved each other. We saw Mike a few more times and kept in touch over the years through social media. When James proposed and we started planning our wedding, we knew we wanted Mike to be in it. He was part of our trio back before James and I even knew we would be together, and the three of us had a bond. We asked him to read something during the ceremony, and he accepted, expressing how honored he felt. Well, when it got to the day of the wedding, Mike was nowhere to be seen. We kept calling him as the ceremony was quickly approaching, and finally James got a hold of him. Mike told him he couldn't get out of work and wouldn't be able to make it. We were both taken aback a little because the Mike we knew and looked up to would never bail like this, and especially not even at least let us know. We figured there had to be some reasonable explanation and were pretty disappointed, but the wedding had to go on. We had James's niece do the reading, even though Mike's name was printed in the program. Fast forward again, a few more years. We had only spoken to Mike a handful of times since the wedding, but he had also taken the time to write me a beautiful, lengthy recommendation letter in that time period. There were no hard feelings about the wedding, and James and I still shared the highest of opinions of our friend. Then Mike kind of disappeared off of social media, and the next time we tried calling him, his phone number had changed. James and I exchanged sentiments of concern and hoped he was doing okay, but didn't go much past that. One day, James got a random call from a number that wasn't in his contacts. He answered it, and it turned out to be Mike, so we put it on speaker so I could also say hello. We had our brief pleasantries, but then Mike got into the reason for his call. He wanted to know if he could stay with us for a day or two. My initial reaction was, of course, but James shot me a sharp look, so I added, "Well, let us discuss it and we'll call you back." Before concluding the call, James inquired about what was going on. Mike said he had been living with his father to take care of him because he was terminally ill, but that he couldn't stay there another night because he checked the camera footage in their home and saw his dad on tape standing over him with a knife while he slept. When the call ended, James said he thought something was off. I didn't really get why he'd instantly be that suspicious. I mean, the story was insane and all, but it was Mike. James said something like, "We haven't heard from him in forever, and now he's calling us for a favor? He lives 2 hours away, and we're the ones he calls. Why wouldn't he seek the help of someone closer? He has family in the area too." I agreed that it was all odd, and it definitely conjured up a lot of questions, including why there were even cameras inside their house. But I still didn't like the idea of leaving Mike hanging if he was truly out of options. I told James we should call back and probe a little more. When we called back, James asked if it would be easier to have someone closer help him out, and asked about family in the area. Mike gave a vague explanation of why everyone in his life had turned against him. Then, with the most mopey, disappointed voice, he said it was okay if we couldn't help, that he understood what was going on, it wouldn't bother us anymore. James and I looked at each other and said we'd call him right back. We quickly discussed that this was all very strange, but that he had to be pretty desperate to contact us for help. We acknowledged that this little bit about understanding if we were unable to help was meant to manipulate us, and we felt conflicted about everything, but ultimately decided a few days couldn't hurt. We called back, told him he could come, and figured we'd give him the address and that would be that, but he said he no longer had a vehicle and would need to be picked up. We asked about catching an Uber, and he said he had no money he could access at the moment, which we didn't pry him on. It was getting late, and it was a long drive to his location, so we asked if he had anywhere to stay for that night, and we could make the trip in the morning. He said he'd just sleep on a park bench or something, which, again, we knew was meant to manipulate us, but we didn't cave in on that one. We asked where we should pick him up the following day, and he gave us his dad's address. Immediately after we got off the phone, we were like, what the fuck has been going on with Mike that has ostracized him from all of his friends, all of his family, and caused him to lose his car? He had been making 4 times our salary when we all first met, had a brand new car, and now he didn't even have money for an Uber? We went out and picked him up the next day. I got out the car, ran up to him and gave him a hug. He seemed oddly unresponsive to my affection, so I just shrugged it off and showed him to the front passenger seat where I'd been sitting. He was super tall, so I let him sit up there and I hopped in the back. When we got back to our house, we showed him to our guest room and he put his things down and then immediately asked if we could take him to the grocery store. James said he was done driving for the day, so I said I'd take him, but commented that I thought he didn't have any money on him. He told me he had food stamps, which there's no way he would have qualified for with his old job. So I knew something was up, but I wasn't going to dig into the personal details of his finances, so I just locked it in my mind and kept my mouth shut. You might be thinking it just sounds like someone who fell on hard times, and that was basically Mike's story as well, but it was just very vague in important areas and full of story after story about people that seemed determined to destroy him for no reason whatsoever. 1 or 2 bad eggs is believable, but no one is the innocent victim in every scenario. He was telling us that he had no idea why his life had fallen apart and why those close to him seemed to turn on him out of nowhere, or why so many people were out to get him without seeming to have any motivation. 2 nights turned into a week, and finally James asked Mike what his plan was. Mike acted hurt and said he'd be gone by morning. We told him he didn't need to leave immediately, but we'd like to have some kind of an idea of his plan moving forward. That night in bed, James and I discussed it. We decided we'd tell Mike that he could stay for as long as he needed if he wanted to help out around the house and kept his room relatively clean, because it did contain several antique items of James's mother's. We were also going to ask him to help me with some entrepreneurial decisions, as Mike did claim to have been a totally self-made, successful entrepreneur before his streak of bad luck, series of unfortunate events, and I had recently been laid off. We presented our offer the next day, and Mike excitedly accepted. We thought it was going to be a rewarding trade-off for all parties. Now, this didn't necessarily start as a story about my marriage, so I'm not going to go too far into the wealth of problems James and I had, but a little info will be necessary. James was highly critical of me, and often talked down to me, and seemed to have nothing but negative opinions. I wasn't perfect, but I wanted to be loved, and I worked my ass off for James's approval. I was constantly trying to make him happy, but no matter what I did, I would fail in his eyes. After a few weeks, Mike clearly started to see the cracks in the marriage, despite the fact that James toned it down in Mike's presence. Trying to be a good wife, I acted like it was all fine in front of Mike, and never mentioned any dissatisfaction in my marriage. Mike and I started to spend a lot of time alone in our entrepreneurial pursuits. He was supposed to be teaching me the tricks of the trade within several avenues of making money, but we kept coming out with little success. He had excuses and explanations for why his wisdom didn't seem to be progressing us forward at all. But he was someone I greatly looked up to as a professional and as a friend, so I just believed that it would all pay off soon, like he said. After living together for weeks, enough talking among all of us had been done to start noticing weird contradictions to many of the things Mike had told us. But he always worded things in a way that left a slight amount of room for doubt if you were to question any of it. There was never a way to straight up catch him in a lie. Mike also wasn't fulfilling his end of our deal at home and kept saying he'd take his turn to do the dishes and such, but probably only did it once or twice, and he completely trashed the guest room. Not only was there garbage everywhere, but he'd bring in food and drinks, and they'd be lost in the sea of clothes and trash, and we could smell things rotting. There was a melted tub of ice cream sitting on the bedside table for weeks. I didn't care as much as James did, and I suggested we just remove his mom's things from the room, but I did agree that it was disrespectful. Meanwhile, things were getting more and more icy with James and I, and one day when I was out with Mike on a job, I broke down in tears about how much I was hurting about how James treated me. Mike offered words of comfort and reluctantly admitted that he'd picked up on how mean James could be to me, and he said that he was very sorry and that I didn't deserve it. Mike possibly being the only witness I ever had to what I had been going through in my marriage made this amazingly validating. Mike agreed that it was incredibly unjustified, but made me promise not to tell James that he'd said anything because he didn't want to appear like he was taking sides. The next day, Mike had once again volunteered to take a turn doing the dishes, so I didn't do them. I hate doing dishes and happily left them for Mike when he assured me he'd handle it. Well, Mike got a call informing him that his dad didn't have long to live, so I wanted to go see him. James didn't seem at all interested in helping, so I volunteered to take him and to stay for moral support, and we headed out. On the way to see his dad, Mike started to tell me his dad has dementia and makes up weird things, so he advised me not to take anything to heart. He cited a few examples of things he'd previously said, and they were all more like accusations. One of them being that Mike had stolen all of the money in his savings. I thought it was pretty odd, but couldn't really reconcile the vast difference between the Mike I had met 8 years before and someone who could rob his dying father. While we were visiting his dad, I didn't say much as I didn't want to insert myself into a private family moment. But I kept noticing things that were weird. Like that his dad was fully conscious and talkative and didn't seem like a dying man at all. He even asked us to get him Burger King in the middle of everything. I kept trying to justify things in my head. Like, who am I to say a dying man can't want a final meal at Burger King? A few hours in, James called, annoyed that I had left again without doing the dishes that Mike promised to do. He chewed me out and threatened divorce, which was always his go-to to try to whip me into shape. And having the recent affirmation from Mike that I wasn't the only one who saw James's emotional abuse, I said, fine, divorce won't be thrown in my face anymore. So, divorce it is. Back in Mike's dad's room, his dad was yelling about his will and money and such, and Mike looked at me in a way to signal that the dementia was talking. I had started to really question what happened with his dad, and if he was really even dying at all, but it wasn't something I could really handle investigating at the moment, given that I just separated from my husband. When we had left the hospital, Mike's dad was still alive and eating candy bars. I had nowhere else to go, so I went back home and slept upstairs on the couch. I didn't speak to James for 2 whole days, and then Mike said he talked to his mom and said I could stay there for a week. I wondered why his mom wasn't the one helping him if they were in good contact and on good terms, but I just accepted the offer. I couldn't take being at that house anymore. Mike said he was going to go with me and stay there too, which I thought looked really bad, but he said he spoke to James and that he understood and was fine with it. I spent the entire week crying and talking to Mike about how I felt, and he even woke up in the middle of the night with me if I woke up and started spiraling. I will say he made no advances on me or anything like that. After the week, I went to stay with my parents, and Mike went back to stay with James. I eventually saw them both when I'd come over to get my things, and in talking with James, he was very much ready for Mike to leave. They barely seemed to talk and didn't seem on good terms whatsoever. One night, I got the weirdest impulse to ask James if Mike ever said anything about me that he made him promise not to tell me. James hesitated for a second but said yes. Through a series of questions, we inched through both of our experiences with Mike. He had been playing into our rapidly declining marriage and using everything he observed against us. He had been going out and teaching me things to make money, and he did the same thing he did as my boss all those years before. Told me my strengths and complimented my ability to catch on to things quickly. We didn't have much success, but it was very obviously not on account of me. However, he was going back and feeding it to James's terrible opinion of me and claiming we weren't making any money because I was so dense and hard to teach. Mike would also comment on the very same things he told me were unacceptable that James did, except he told James he doesn't know how he lives with someone like me and that he'd go insane. He was carefully and strategically forcing our marriage to fall apart by exacerbating our personal fears and insecurities and systematically validating and encouraging our resentment for one another. He did it in such a way that neither of us doubted his sincerity for a moment, until I finally got a weird feeling and decided to ask that night. And even then, I didn't really anticipate finding out that he'd been two-faced and manipulative to that extreme. James kicked him out that night, and neither of us talked to him again, as far as I know. I haven't spoken to James in going on 2 years. I proceeded with the divorce despite this, because even though Mike was an insincere piece of shit, he caused me to get enough distance from James that I was able to see I deserved so much better. Last I heard about Mike was from his mom, who called me to see why he'd been asked to abruptly leave James's house. I told her what he'd done, and she didn't even seem surprised. I asked if she was aware of any mental problems he may have, and she said she didn't want to betray her son by giving details, but that he isn't right in the head. I asked about several of the traumatic events Mike had claimed to be the victim of, and she said there has never been any evidence that any of it ever happened. I don't know why he actively initiated the final downfall of my marriage, because I never felt it was an attempt to be with me. I don't get what his motivations or gain would have been. Mike's mom texted me a few days after he left James's house to tell me he had been admitted into a psychiatric facility and wouldn't be out for a long time, and she wouldn't elaborate.